Hello everybody, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and we're talking about a new promo today. Vara, Vengeance Seeker, has finally been revealed. She's part of an upcoming campaign, most likely going to be released with the game. I'm not sure when the game is going into release, or whether or not this is going to happen before release, or what all's happening there, but nonetheless, it looks like we're going to have a new campaign with a bunch of new cards, including Vara at last. We knew Vara was coming because she was not in the draft packs. All of the draft packs in Eternal are curated to have specific, basically story cards in the draft packs at the moment. Basically all of the heroes. Any dead heroes are not in the packs, and neither are any of the older versions of the heroes. So the first Caleb, the first Talir, the first Eileen, none of those are in the draft packs, because basically we have new versions of those cards, so the most current versions are not in the packs. But also there's no Vara in the draft packs, which was a pretty strong indication that Vara Vengeance Seeker was going to be coming along anytime now. And now we have her, and she is a doozy. Definitely a super powerful card for Shadow, and a very, very strong, I would say mostly mid-range beater, but also pretty good in some aggressive decks and some more fast decks. She can be played in pretty much anything. She's really, really good in, I would say, whatever you want to put her in, because she plays pretty well with... She has basically Sandstorm Titan level stats. She ends up being a 5/6 most of the time, with both Lifesteal and Deadly at 4 for 2 Shadow Influence, which is an awful lot of things to put together, and definitely makes it so that you have a nice pushed Shadow card that you can play that's going to be the kind of card that people want to play around and figure out ways to adapt their meta decks to best deal with Vara. On that front, I think there is going to be a lot of adapting to Vara happening. Certain decks are going to change around in the meta, certain things are going to change in terms of patterns, but there are a lot of ways to also defeat Vara or effectively stop her. So I would say that this card in terms of power level is going to be pretty meta defining, but isn't going to be like completely overpowered. There's actually a lot of things that we can talk about with her in terms of what she's going to do and what kind of stuff that she can actually what kind of situations she can create versus what kind of situations she's actually very bad in. Alright, so let's take a look at the card itself first things first. 4 cost, 2 Shadow Influence, Darkstorm Titan level, just basic mid-rangey stuff. There's not a lot of good 4-drops in Shadow at this level. You've got Impending Doom, which is pretty good. You've got some good hybrid cards like Crown Watch Trader, but Mono Shadow basically just has Impending Doom, and I think potentially, no, Mazeg's a 5, I'm pretty sure. So there's not a lot going on in Shadow at 4, and that actually kind of has shown in terms of building Shadow mid-range decks. You often see a lot of Xenon built in together. Sandstorm Titan, you don't see as much of like Feln mid-range or Stonescar mid-range, which is a place where I think that Vara is really going to fit in and make those decks a little bit more viable. So Mono Shadow decks, Stonescar mid-range, Feln mid-range, a lot of those like archetypes that you might not actually see now have a representative card in the 4 slot to play out and basically make those decks a little bit more viable. So we might see some interesting options in that setup if we want to get that done. She's got Lifesteal, and her main ability is that nothing can have an Aegis, similar to Sandstorm Titan's global effect. She actually has something of her own. She's a Lifestorm Titan. She gets to prevent things from basically having Aegises. The suppression effect activates when she comes into play, so it will automatically just turn off all of the Aegises that are currently in play. Any Aegises that come into play will not be Aegises, so there will be no Aegis on anything that happens. And if she dies, any Aegises that she has removed or suppressed do not return. So you will just knock off all of the Aegises on all of the decks when you play this card, and you will be able to use your removal cards as you like, including cards like Annihilate, Suffocate, Death Strike, Feeding Time. Those cards are definitely going to get us a lot of value in this particular setup. And yeah, that's pretty strong stuff. There's a lot to like about that as far as things go. Okay, so that's pretty powerful, and it also shuts down one of the more interesting decks that has been like really hard tier 1 for a while now, but wasn't nerfed super hard in the most recent balance patch, which is to say Combre Alessi. Alessi with Safe Return and Stand Together and all of that kind of stuff has been sort of a really powerful tier 1 deck for a while now, and this is a deck to make that deck look a little bit silly. If you're playing Shadow, you have a pretty good answer to Stand Together, you have a pretty good answer to some of this other stuff. It's not a perfect answer, there's still a lot of interesting interactions between Stand Together and some of these other setups. Like if Vara is out, then you can't Stand Together, but you can Stand Together to resist cards like Harsh Rule still. You can still use it reactively in a lot of good ways. Like I would say that Alessi is not going to be completely unfavored against a Vara Vengeance Seeker deck. You have to play other cards that beat Alessi as well. But this is definitely a good meta hose for those heavy Aegis decks that use a lot of Stand Together and a lot of other Aegis cards to sort of push through pretty non-interactive playstyles against more removal pile focused control decks. In Control, I'm not sure that I like her for that reason. Like, I would say that while she does shut off Aegises, that's okay, but the main thing about Vara being in a Control deck is that you also have to have other units in Control. I can see this in a Feln-style deck where you're playing Bloodcaster and Champion and Black Sky Harbinger and potentially a couple of other cards, but if you have too few units, Vara is actually really easy to remove. Her stat line is modular. She either is a 3/4, or the enemy player sacrifices a unit to give Vara, or the enemy player can either sacrifice a unit to make her a 3/4, or he can not sacrifice a unit, or they cannot sacrifice a unit to give Vara +2/+2 and Deadly. So she can either be a 5/6 with Deadly, or she can not be a 5/6 with Deadly and your opponent loses a unit. Ideally, your opponent is going to want to let Vara resolve most of the time, and then use Vanquish or Annihilate or something along those lines to just kill her very quickly. If you're playing in a control-based deck, this is really easy to do because you aren't using a lot of those cards on other types of cards that your opponent has. Like, basically, Annihilate is usually dead against Feln control because Feln runs no monocolored cards. So if you're playing Vara Vengeance Seeker in there, then you're going to find that you play Vara, you maybe shut off some Aegises, and then Vara dies. And that's okay value. It's not amazing in Control, but there are other control archetypes that you can build out of Vara that can really take advantage of that Aegis effect. So, like, I would say that certainly she can belong in certain control decks. I'm more interested in her as a mid-range card or as a top end to more aggressive shadow decks that are doing things like running Ripknife Assassin and going in very quickly with Impending Doom over the top. If you are doing like a lot of that kind of aggression, then having a big pile of stats that also either forces your opponent to sacrifice a blocker or makes itself into a 5/6 is really good in terms of just creating a nasty threat that your opponent has to deal with. Now, the thing about Vara, in terms of measuring her against Sandstorm Titan, I think that she is a very powerful card and a very pushed card for Shadow. I would not put her above Sandstorm Titan in terms of strength. Her overall abilities all add up pretty well, but one of the things that's really unusual about her is that she is, the term I've been using has been reverse modular, but I don't really know how to describe it. She gives your opponent a choice, which is to say your opponent can either sacrifice the unit, or your opponent can give Vara +2/+2 and Deadly. This creates some problems with her where you can basically deal with her in a lot of different ways in the meta. One thing that you can do is you can run lots of tokens and little things that you're perfectly okay to sacrifice and then just run some hard removal, or even like some low removal like Suffocate. You can also just ignore that effect and run lots of stuff that kills big and tough creatures, like Vanquish or Annihilate, of course, are all pretty good options. Because you kind of get to adapt how you want to kill Vara, or what the best way to deal with Vara is, the chance that Vara actually gets dealt with on the turn that she comes out is, I would say, a little bit higher than that of a Sandstorm Titan, which is just a very inflexible, fairly non-modular unit that will just do one thing and be big, and if you don't have an answer for it, then it sucks. Like Vara, you have a few more answers to her, but some of those answers might cost you a little bit, and in that sense, Vara can do decent work, but she also might not actually create the kind of situation or stabilization point that you want out of her. She does have lifesteal, so she trades really well against aggro decks. She does pretty well in establishing your aggro deck as the more aggro deck, because if your opponent is trying to attack into you or even defend against you, you have lifesteal, you're gaining the life, you're feeling a little bit better on that front. She's a very good mid-range card because she is always worth at least 1 card and frequently worth 2. Which, yeah, that's a thing that you really want out of this. If your opponent sacrifices a smaller unit and then just kind of has lots of big units to deal with Vara, that doesn't feel great, but there is a lot of potential for Vara to be repeated with other effects, such as Dark Return, the other Vara, and, of course, Haunting Scream, to consistently force your opponent to sacrifice units, and to basically just value out your opponent by either building stats onto Vara or making your opponent just lose a significant quantity of their board, which, yeah, that's pretty rough stuff. Like, overall, the power points are definitely there. She's extremely strong. She does basically everything you want to do in the 4 slot. The fact that she is maybe like a little less strong than Sandstorm Titan is not a reason not to play her. I would say this card is highly pushed. You want to play her in most shadow decks, but there are situations where you're not going to want to play her, and situations where you might want to consider playing something else. But yeah, like, overall, this card definitely does like really, really good things, and the fact that it is a little bit easier to kill is not a huge point against it. So yeah, we don't have any sort of flavor on this card yet, and I am a little bit disappointed by the art in that respect. Like, she matches up, we've actually matched the art here, I think, with something going on in the Shadowlands. She's very similar to the previous Vara in terms of art. There's nothing new going on. She's holding on to something that I can't really see here, but looks like a cutlass. And beyond that, she has Azindal's Gift in her hand, so she's basically the same Vara that she was before. I really want to see what's happening with Vara in the new storyline. I'm sure that there will be a campaign mostly focused around her, so it's not a big deal that we don't know anything that's going on from the art in this card, but I would like to see some sort of change to Vara overall, and that's going to be interesting to see. Yeah, like, it's kind of cool to have a shadow version of the Sandstorm Titan and have it be a Scion. I would say that this is, like, definitely has some parallels with that card, some pretty obvious ways that you can sort of see that it is a similar vein. It's got the global effect, it's got the useful skill, and it's actually got a second useful skill. The summon ability makes it a little bit weird, but yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on with it, and yeah, it's pretty cool to see. Yeah, as far as we are in the plotline, Vara is currently pursuing things on the Xenon side. She's running against cultists and basically just like trying to hunt down Azindal for stealing her memories. I think she's already recovered from whatever was going on with her and is now like sort of out for vengeance, resorting to more brutal methods and being significantly more aggressive, and this definitely is a more aggressive and more interesting card. So yeah, it seems pretty cool. So decks that you might want to play this in, like, I would say that you play this in pretty much any sort of shadow-based mid-range. You consider playing it in more aggressive decks as well. I'm interested to see Stonescar mid-range play with this. I'm interested to see Feln mid-range play with this with a big pile of units. You can play her in control, but I'm not sure if that's going to be all that good of an idea unless you are really having problems with Aegis decks and Stand Together and that kind of thing. She works well with Champion of Cunning, to be sure. She plays well with Black Sky Harbinger and all of that Feln stuff, so certainly if you're playing like a heavy amount of creature-based control, Vara Vengeance Seeker can be extremely strong in those scenarios and do a lot of good stuff there. So yeah, that's definitely something to play around with. I like her in Haunting Scream. I am interested to see her in Argenport and see if she can actually do some work in Argenport with some of the other cards in Argenport that are already very strong in that slot, such as Crownwatch Trader and Impending Doom. I think that she's very, very powerful in Xenon and gives Xenon something really interesting in the 4 slot where you have basically double Titans in that slot and you can play around with killer effects and seeded killers and have basically a really, really good time with that. So yeah, that seems like it's going to be something that could definitely really do well with her. And of course, she's a solid mono shadow card overall. So I see her in a lot of mid-range decks. I see her as definitely a very powerful, very high-end card. She's way up there in terms of what's been pushed, but she also does have a lot of ways to play around her. If you want to play around Vara, play decks that have a lot of sacrificable units. Cards like Slumbering Stone and Dark Wisp are always good options. Play lots of tokens. Don't play as many cards that have Aegis, obviously, but also be aggressive. If you want to be aggressive, if you're playing like a Skycrag deck or something like that, I don't think it's a huge issue. You just basically play Permafrost and potentially Mortar as well. Skycrag does have a lot of Aegis units that they really like to run in, and they don't love a 3/4 lifesteal as far as things go, but there are ways around Vara that I think Skycrag decks will not have too hard of a time finding, using cards like Cinder Yeti, Permafrost, Polymorph, and most of the stuff that they should be running anyways, but in greater numbers. I think that, like, in terms of what she can do to the meta, because she's going to be stomping on Alessi decks a little bit, because she's going to be maybe forcing decks to be a little bit slower, or causing decks to have like a little bit more of like that mortar effect, basically running like things that actually kill things with 4 health. I think this might actually cause some other archetypes to come back, like because she's shutting down the stand together meta and basically like forcing those decks to have a little bit of a shift. There may be room for some other interesting decks to come out and have some fun. She's most interesting actually against Icaria decks, which is probably one of the places that she's even better at than in dealing with than like Stand Together, because she often can be a card that is fairly hard to kill, and she forces Icaria to not have an Aegis, which can be kind of interesting. She's got 4 health, which means she's immune to Torch and Rezon. She sometimes is a 5/6, which means she's almost certainly going to be killed by Vanquish most of the time, and Harsh Rule. But if you have enough different threats available to play against those types of decks, then Vara Vengeance Seeker actually feels pretty good in that scenario. Yeah, like overall, cool power push, should really shake up the meta. Like, you can definitely see maybe some Rakano decks coming out of the woodwork once again to basically just kill Vara with Vanquish and play a lot of more like mid-rangey and Warcry focused aggro strategies against her. I can see like a lot more mid-range in general coming out, or a lot more just hard control. I don't see as much of some of the decks that are currently in the meta. I think it's going to be a big shakeup, and I'm not sure where it's all going to land, but obviously this card is going to make a pretty big splash, and I'm excited about that. That's about it as far as my current impression of Vara goes. So thank you guys so much for watching. To the YouTube folks, feel free to like and subscribe, and to the Twitch folks, let's get back to games.